At 28,000 feet above the Alaskan wilderness, Captain Carol Brennan felt the first violent shudder tear through her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The warning lights erupted across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree from hell. Engine failure, hydraulic system compromised, fire warning. In the span of 3 seconds, her routine training mission transformed into a fight for survival that would test every limit of human endurance against one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in military aviation history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of February 14, 2019 started like any other at Elmendorf Air Force Base. Captain Carol Brennan, a 29-year-old fighter pilot from Phoenix, Arizona, completed her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had earned her a reputation as one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. The daughter of a mechanic and a high school teacher, Carol had defied expectations her entire life. Growing up in the desert heat of Arizona, she'd never imagined that ice and snow would one day determine whether she lived or died. The mission briefing had been straightforward, a solo navigation exercise over the remote Alaskan interior. Weather conditions were marginal but acceptable, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit at ground level with scattered clouds and moderate winds. Carol would fly a predetermined route covering approximately 400 miles of wilderness, practicing low-level navigation techniques essential for combat operations. At 900 hours, Carol's F-16C roared down the runway and lifted into the crystalline Arctic sky. The landscape below stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of white punctuated by dark patches of spruce and birch forests. Mountain ranges jutted from the snow like the spines of sleeping giants. This was Alaska in its rawest form, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. For the first hour and 47 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Carol executed her waypoints with textbook precision, her aircraft responding flawlessly to every command. She radioed position reports back to base right on schedule, her voice calm and professional over the static-filled comm channel. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the tundra below. Then, without warning, everything changed. The initial explosion came from somewhere behind the cockpit, a sound Carol later described as like being inside a giant bell when someone strikes it with a sledgehammer. Her aircraft lurched violently to the right, throwing her against her restraint system with enough force to bruise her ribs. The master caution light blazed to life, followed immediately by a cascade of warning indicators. Engine fire! Engine fire! The aircraft's automated warning system announced in its emotionless mechanical voice. Carol's training kicked in instantly. She reached for the engine fire extinguisher handle, pulled it, and waited the prescribed 15 seconds before activating the extinguisher system. The fire warning light remained stubbornly illuminated. Her situational awareness expanded rapidly as she processed multiple system failures simultaneously. The engine had not just failed, it had suffered what appeared to be an uncontained failure, with metal fragments likely severing hydraulic lines and electrical systems throughout the aircraft. Flight control response was becoming increasingly sluggish, and she could feel the F-16 developing an uncommanded roll to the right. Carol attempted to contact Elmendorf Tower, keying her radio multiple times. Nothing but static answered her calls. Either her radio had failed or she was already too far from base for reliable communication. She tried the emergency frequency, then the backup radio system. Silence. The aircraft's nose began dropping despite her inputs on the flight controls. She was losing altitude steadily now, and her airspeed was bleeding off faster than she could compensate for. Through her heads-up display, she could see the terrain rising to meet her, an endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness broken by jagged ridgelines and frozen lakes. Carol ran through her emergency procedures with mechanical precision, but the aircraft was fighting her at every turn. The backup hydraulic system showed zero pressure. The electrical system was failing progressively, with instruments going dark one by one. She had perhaps 5 minutes of controlled flight remaining, maybe less. At 27,000 feet, she made the decision that would save her life. There would be no miraculous recovery, no heroic deadstick landing. The F-16 was dying around her, and she had only one option left. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. She broadcast on the emergency frequency, hoping someone, somewhere, might hear her final transmission. Falker 47 experiencing multiple system failures, preparing to eject approximately 200 miles northeast of Elmendorf. She reached down and grasped the ejection seat handle between her legs. Everything she had trained for, every emergency procedure she had memorized, came down to this single moment. Pull the handle and trust in physics, engineering, and luck to deliver her safely to the ground. Hesitate and die with her aircraft. Carol pulled. The ejection sequence unfolded with violent precision. Explosive charges blew the aircraft's canopy away into the slipstream. A fraction of a second later, the rocket motor beneath her seat ignited upward, applying her upward along the ejection rails with a force that drove her down into the seat like a giant's fist. In less than 2 seconds, she was clear of the doomed fighter, tumbling through the thin air at 26,000 feet. The automatic systems performed flawlessly. Her drogue chute deployed first, stabilizing her wild tumble and slowing her descent. At 14,000 feet, the main parachute deployed with a jarring snap that she felt through every bone in her body. Suddenly, the world became eerily quiet. The roar of jet engines and rushing wind gave way to an almost supernatural silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through her parachute's suspension lines. Below her, Carol watched her F-16 carve a lazy spiral toward the earth, trailing smoke and debris. It impacted the side of a snow-covered ridge in a brilliant orange fireball that sent a pillar of black smoke climbing toward the overcast sky. The explosion echoed across the wilderness for long seconds before fading into silence. Now comes the real challenge. Carol hung beneath her parachute canopy, drifting slowly toward a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Snow stretched to every horizon, broken only by the dark lines of frozen streams and the occasional patch of stunted trees. The temperature at ground level would be at least minus 35 degrees, with a wind chill that could drop the effective temperature to minus 60 or below. She had her survival gear, the equipment every military pilot carries in case of ejection. A survival radio, emergency food rations, a sleeping bag rated to minus 40 degrees, signaling devices, a first aid kit, and various tools for shelter construction and fire starting. It sounded adequate in theory, but Carol knew the brutal mathematics of Arctic survival. In this environment, every decision could mean the difference between rescue and death. The ground rushed up faster than expected. Carol prepared for landing by pulling her knees up and keeping her feet together, exactly as she'd been taught. She hit the snow with tremendous force, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending a shockwave of pain through her left ankle. The parachute dragged her forward through the snow for 30 feet before she managed to activate the quick-release mechanism and free herself from the harness. Silence returned, absolute and profound. Carol lay in the snow for a long moment, taking inventory of her body and her situation. Her ankle throbbed with what felt like a severe sprain, but she could move it. No broken bones that she could detect, though she knew adrenaline might be masking more serious injuries. The cold was already seeping through her flight suit, and she could feel the moisture from her breath beginning to freeze on the inside of her helmet visor. Standing required tremendous effort. The snow was nearly waist-deep, and each step was a struggle against the crystalline quicksand that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Carol gathered her parachute and survival gear, knowing that every piece of equipment could prove vital in the hours and days ahead. She was alive, but her ordeal was just beginning. Somewhere in this frozen wasteland, she would have to find shelter, start a fire, signal for rescue, and survive long enough for help to arrive. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and with it would come the killing cold of an Arctic night. The first priority was shelter. Carol had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining, and she knew that surviving her first night would determine everything that followed. The wind was picking up, driving ice crystals across the surface like microscopic bullets. Each gust cut through her flight suit as if the fabric were made of paper. She surveyed her landing site with a tactical eye. A small grove of stunted spruce trees stood about 200 yards to her east, their dark branches heavy with snow. Beyond that, the land rose gradually toward a ridge that might offer some protection from the prevailing wind. But 200 yards might as well have been 2 miles in snow this deep with her injured ankle. Carol began the exhausting journey toward the tree line, dragging her parachute and survival pack behind her. Each step required her to lift her leg high enough to clear the snow, then plunge it down until she felt solid ground beneath. The effort was enormous, and she could already feel sweat beginning to freeze against her skin beneath her flight suit. Sweating in Arctic conditions was potentially fatal. Wet clothing lost its insulating properties, and the moisture would freeze, creating an internal refrigeration system that could kill her within hours. 20 minutes of brutal progress brought her to the edge of the spruce grove. Her ankle was screaming with pain, and she could feel it swelling inside her boot. But she had reached relative shelter, and more importantly, she had fuel for a fire. Carol's survival training had been thorough, but there was a vast difference between classroom theory and the reality of trying to build a shelter while fighting hypothermia and exhaustion. She chose a spot between 2 larger spruce trees where the snow was slightly less deep, then began the back-breaking work of excavation. Using her hands and a small folding shovel from her survival kit, she dug down through 3 feet of powder to reach the earth beneath. Her hands were already going numb despite her insulated gloves, and she had to stop frequently to restore circulation by tucking her fingers inside her jacket. The physical exertion helped generate body heat, but it also accelerated her breathing, and she could see each exhale create a small cloud of vapor that instantly froze into ice crystals. Once she had excavated a rectangular depression roughly 8 feet by 4 feet, Carol began constructing walls using blocks of compressed snow. The parachute would serve as her roof, stretched between the spruce branches and anchored with more snow blocks. It wasn't pretty, but it would break the wind and trap her body heat. The sun was touching the horizon when she finally crawled into her improvised shelter. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she estimated it would reach -50 degrees or lower during the night. Carol unrolled her sleeping bag and arranged her emergency gear within easy reach. The survival radio would be crucial. She needed to attempt contact with rescue forces, but she also needed to conserve its battery power for when aircraft might actually be in range. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She tried the radio first on the emergency frequency, speaking slowly and clearly. Mayday. Mayday. This is Captain Carol Brennan, call sign Falcon 47. I ejected from my aircraft approximately 35 miles northeast of the Tanana River Valley. I am alive and have shelter, but require immediate assistance. My emergency locator beacon should be transmitting on 243.0. Only static answered her call. She tried twice more on different frequencies before switching off the radio to preserve battery power. Help would come. She had to believe that, but it might take time. Search and rescue operations in Alaska could be delayed by weather, distance, and the sheer vastness of the territory to be covered. Carol's emergency locator beacon was designed to transmit continuously for at least 48 hours, sending her position to satellites that would relay the information to rescue coordination centers. But electronic devices could fail in extreme cold, and there was no guarantee the beacon had survived the ejection sequence intact. Darkness fell with Arctic swiftness, transforming her world into a realm of absolute black, broken only by the pale reflection of snow. The temperature plummeted, and she could hear the trees around her shelter creaking and popping as their sap froze. Her breath created a layer of frost on the inside of her shelter, and despite the protection of her sleeping bag, the cold seeped through everything. The first night tested every aspect of her mental and physical endurance. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, interrupted by the need to move her extremities to maintain circulation. Her injured ankle throbbed with a pain that seemed to intensify with the dropping temperature. Several times she woke to find ice forming on the exposed parts of her face, and she had to warm her hands against her body before she could feel her fingers well enough to check her equipment. But she survived the night, and when the first gray light of dawn began to seep across the landscape, Carol felt a surge of confidence that surprised her with its strength. She was still alive, still thinking clearly, still capable of making the decisions that would keep her that way. Her water situation was actually manageable. She could melt snow for drinking water using her small camping stove, though she would need to be careful about fuel consumption. The greater challenge was food. Her survival rations would last perhaps 4 days if she ate conservatively, but burning calories to stay warm in sub-zero temperatures meant her body needed far more fuel than normal. She would have to find additional sources of nutrition or face the gradual weakness that came with starvation. On her second day, Carol decided to move to a better location. Her shelter had served its purpose for one night, but she needed to find a more permanent base, somewhere with better protection from the wind and easier access to firewood. She also needed to position herself in an area where rescue aircraft would have a better chance of spotting her. The journey nearly killed her. What should have been a half-mile trek to higher ground became an 8-hour ordeal through snow that sometimes reached her chest. Her injured ankle gave out completely halfway through the trek, and she was forced to continue by dragging herself forward on her hands and knees, pulling her gear behind her. But the new location proved worth the agony. A natural rock outcropping provided a windbreak, and a small grove of dead timber offered an abundance of firewood. Most importantly, she was now positioned on a slight rise that would make her more visible to searching aircraft. Carol spent the remainder of daylight improving her shelter and gathering wood. Fire would be essential not just for warmth, but for melting snow, cooking food, and signaling rescue aircraft. She built a fire pit using rocks from the outcropping, then spent an hour using her waterproof matches to coax a small flame to life in the tinder-dry deadwood. The sight of that first flame dancing in the growing darkness filled her with an emotion she could barely describe. Part relief, part triumph, part desperate hope. Fire meant life. Fire meant she could survive another night, and another day after that, until help arrived. As she settled into her improved shelter for her second night in the wilderness, Carol allowed herself to think beyond mere survival. Someone would be looking for her. Her squadron commander would have initiated search procedures when she failed to return from her mission. The emergency locator beacon was broadcasting her position to the world. Modern search and rescue techniques were sophisticated and thorough. She just had to stay alive enough for them to find her. Outside her shelter, the aurora borealis began its nightly dance across the star-filled sky, sheets of green and blue light rippling like celestial curtains. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it was simply another reminder of how far she was from the world of warm buildings and reliable shelter, how completely she was at the mercy of one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Day 3 brought a discovery that would change everything. Carol woke to the distant sound of aircraft engines, a deep, throbbing noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She scrambled from her shelter, grabbing her signaling mirror and emergency flares, her heart pounding with desperate hope. The sound grew louder, then faded, then disappeared entirely. She stood in the snow for 20 minutes, scanning the overcast sky, but saw nothing. It could have been a commercial airliner passing overhead at 35,000 feet, or it could have been a search aircraft that had come tantalizingly close to finding her. Either way, it meant her emergency beacon was likely working, and someone, somewhere, knew she was missing. But the incident also revealed a critical flaw in her survival strategy. Her current position, while protected from the wind, was partially concealed by the surrounding terrain. If she was going to be spotted from the air, she needed to be in a more visible location during daylight hours. Carol spent the morning studying the landscape around her camp. About a quarter-mile to the north, she could see what appeared to be a frozen lake, a flat, open expanse that would be clearly visible to aircraft. The problem was getting there. Her ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and walking even short distances had become excruciating. She solved the problem with military ingenuity. Using branches from the dead timber and strips of fabric cut from her parachute, Carol constructed a makeshift sledge. It wasn't elegant, but it would allow her to transport her essential gear to the lake without having to carry everything through the deep snow. The journey to the lake took most of the afternoon and left her exhausted, but the new location offered exactly what she needed. The frozen surface provided a clear landing zone for rescue helicopters, and more importantly, it gave her 360-degree visibility of the sky. She established a signal site at the center of the lake, arranging bright orange panels from her survival kit in a large X pattern that would be visible from miles away. That evening, Carol made her first significant mistake. Overconfident from her successful relocation and buoyed by the possibility of imminent rescue, she built her fire larger than usual, using extra wood to create a substantial blaze that would be visible for miles. The warmth felt luxurious after 3 days of carefully rationed heat, and she allowed herself to relax for the first time since her ejection. She woke up 4 hours later to find her fire reduced to cold ashes and her body shivering uncontrollably. The temperature had dropped to what felt like -60 degrees, and she had violated one of the cardinal rules of Arctic survival: never let your fire die completely. Restarting a fire in extreme cold required enormous energy and precious resources, and she had only a limited number of waterproof matches remaining. It took her nearly 2 hours to coax new flames to life, and the effort cost her dearly. Her fingers became so numb that she nearly couldn't operate her lighter, and several times she came close to losing consciousness from the combination of cold and exhaustion. By the time she had a sustainable fire burning again, she had learned a lesson that could have killed her. Day 4 brought new challenges in the form of weather. Carol woke to find her world transformed by a blizzard that had moved in during the night. Snow fell so heavily that she could barely see 20 feet in any direction, and the wind drove the crystalline particles with such force that venturing outside her shelter was nearly impossible. The storm presented both dangers and opportunities. On one hand, it made air search operations impossible and buried her carefully arranged signal panels under 2 feet of new snow. On the other hand, the fresh snow provided excellent insulation for her shelter, and she was able to improve her living conditions significantly by packing the new powder around her walls. But the blizzard also forced her to confront some uncomfortable mathematical realities. Her food supplies were running dangerously low. She had perhaps 1.5 days of rations remaining. Her fuel for the camping stove would last maybe another day beyond that. Most critically, her supply of waterproof matches was down to fewer than a dozen, and if she lost the ability to make fire, she would die within hours in these conditions. Carol spent the storm working on long-term survival preparations. Using her knife and some ingenuity, she constructed several primitive tools: a spear for fishing through the ice, snares for catching small game, and a bow drill fire-starting apparatus that would work even if her matches ran out. The ice fishing spear represented her best chance for additional food. The lake beneath her feet almost certainly contained fish, and Arctic species like lake trout and grayling remained active even under thick ice. The challenge was creating a hole in ice that was probably 3 to 4 feet thick, and doing so without falling through in the process. When the blizzard finally cleared on the morning of day 5, Carol faced a landscape that had been completely transformed. Her signal panels were buried, her fire pit was filled with snow, and drifts had piled up against her shelter to the point where she had to dig her way out. But the sky was crystal clear and the silence was profound. She spent the morning re-establishing her signal site and scouting for the best location to attempt ice fishing. Using her knife and the small axe from her survival kit, she began the laborious process of chopping through the ice. The work was exhausting, and every few minutes she had to stop to warm her hands and restore feeling to her fingers. 3 hours of steady work produced a hole roughly 2 feet in diameter that penetrated through to dark water below. Carol baited her improvised hook with a small piece of beef jerky from her rations and lowered it into the depths. Ice fishing required patience under the best of circumstances, and these were far from the best of circumstances. But her patience was rewarded. Within an hour, she felt the distinctive tug of a fish taking the bait. The lake trout she hauled up through the ice hole weighed perhaps 3 pounds, not large, but enough protein to extend her survival time by several days. Preparing the fish presented new challenges. She had to work quickly to prevent the catch from freezing solid before she could clean it, and she had to be careful not to waste any edible portion. The raw fish was surprisingly palatable, and she found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't felt since her ordeal began. That afternoon brought the sound she had been praying for: helicopter rotors. The distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades carried clearly across the frozen landscape, growing steadily louder. Carol grabbed her signaling mirror and emergency flares, positioning herself at the center of her signal panels. The helicopter appeared as a small dot against the blue sky, flying a search pattern perhaps 2 miles to the south. Carol fired 2 flares in rapid succession, the brilliant red streaks arcing high into the clear air. She worked her signaling mirror frantically, trying to catch the sun and reflect it toward the aircraft. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the helicopter might pass by without seeing her. The aircraft continued its methodical search pattern, showing no sign of deviation. Then, suddenly, it banked sharply and began flying directly toward her position. The rescue helicopter circled her position twice before beginning its descent toward the frozen lake. Carol felt a surge of elation so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. After 5 days of fighting for survival in conditions that could kill within hours, rescue was finally at hand. She waved frantically at the approaching aircraft, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. But as the helicopter descended, Carol noticed something that made her heart sink. The aircraft was struggling against powerful downdrafts created by the surrounding terrain. The pilot attempted to hover just above the ice surface, but the rotor wash was creating a whiteout condition that made precise positioning impossible. Worse, the weight of the aircraft was causing ominous cracks to spider across the ice beneath the landing zone. The helicopter pulled up abruptly, climbing to a safe altitude while the crew assessed the situation. Through her survival radio, Carol heard the pilot's voice for the first time. "Survivor on the ice, this is Alaska Rescue 7-2. We have you in sight but cannot safely land on the current surface. The ice appears unstable and our rotor wash is compromising visibility. We're going to attempt a different approach." The aircraft moved to a position about 50 yards away where the ice appeared thicker. This time, the pilot approached more cautiously, bringing the helicopter to a low hover without actually touching down. A crew member appeared in the open doorway, lowering a rescue basket on a steel cable. Carol gathered her essential gear and began moving toward the basket, but the deep snow made progress agonizingly slow. Each step was a struggle, and her injured ankle screamed with pain. The helicopter crew was operating on limited fuel in dangerous conditions. Every second counted. 20 yards from the basket, disaster struck. The ice beneath Carol's feet gave way without warning, plunging her into water so cold it felt like liquid fire. The shock of immersion drove the air from her lungs, and for a moment she was completely disoriented, unsure which way was up. Training and desperation took over. Carol kicked toward what she hoped was the surface, her heavy winter gear dragging her down like an anchor. Her lungs burned with the need for air, and she could feel her body shutting down as hypothermia began its rapid assault on her nervous system. She broke the surface gasping, but staying afloat was nearly impossible. Her flight suit and boots had filled with water, adding 50 pounds of dead weight. The helicopter crew was shouting instructions, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Carol had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before the cold water would render her unconscious. The rescue swimmer didn't hesitate. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison dove from the helicopter into the frigid water, swimming powerfully towards Carol's position. Morrison was a veteran of dozens of water rescues, but Arctic water presented challenges that pushed even his considerable skills to their limits. He reached Carol just as her strength was failing. "I've got you," he shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Stop fighting and let me do the work." He wrapped a flotation collar around her chest and began swimming toward the rescue basket, which the crew had repositioned at the edge of the ice hole. Getting Carol into the basket required precise teamwork between Morrison and the helicopter crew. The pilot had to maintain a steady hover while the flight engineer operated the hoist, all while fighting wind conditions that threatened to push the aircraft into the trees. Carol was barely conscious by the time they hauled her clear of the water, her body temperature dropping toward levels that would cause cardiac arrest. The helicopter crew worked with practiced efficiency once Carol was aboard. They stripped off her wet clothing and wrapped her in specialized warming blankets designed for hypothermia patients. Heated oxygen flowed through a mask over her face, and IV warming fluids began raising her core temperature from the inside out. Morrison, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle with hypothermia after his heroic rescue dive. The crew worked on both patients simultaneously as the helicopter raced toward Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, the nearest facility equipped to handle severe cold injuries. Carol drifted in and out of consciousness during the 40-minute flight. When awareness returned, she found herself surrounded by the controlled chaos of a hospital emergency room. Medical personnel moved with urgent precision, monitoring her vital signs and continuing the rewarming process that would determine whether she would survive without permanent injury. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency physician overseeing Carol's care, later described her condition as critical but recoverable. Her core body temperature had dropped to 84 degrees Fahrenheit, Chen explained. "Another 10 minutes in that water and we probably would have lost her." As it was, she was experiencing moderate hypothermia with some frostbite damage to her extremities, but no permanent impairment. The rewarming process was almost as dangerous as the initial hypothermia. Raising body temperature too quickly could cause fatal cardiac arrhythmias, so medical teams had to carefully control the rate of temperature increase while monitoring for complications. But Carol's ordeal wasn't quite over. As sensation returned to her hands and feet, she experienced the excruciating pain that accompanied the restoration of blood flow to frostbitten tissue. For several hours, the pain was so intense that she required significant medication to remain conscious and coherent. During her recovery, Carol learned about the massive search effort that had been mounted to find her. The operation involved multiple aircraft, ground teams, and sophisticated electronic tracking equipment. Her emergency locator beacon had indeed functioned correctly, providing searchers with a general area to focus on, but the vast expanse of Alaskan wilderness had made the actual location process extremely challenging. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, Carol's squadron commander, visited her hospital room on the second day of her recovery. "You've been the subject of considerable discussion," he told her with a slight smile. "Surviving 5 days in those conditions with minimal equipment, that's going to be studied by survival instructors for years to come." The investigation into her aircraft's mechanical failure revealed a catastrophic engine failure caused by a manufacturing defect in a turbine blade. The blade had fractured under stress, sending metal fragments through the engine casing and severing multiple aircraft systems. Carol's decision to eject when she did had almost certainly saved her life. The F-16 would have been uncontrollable within another minute or two. More importantly for military aviation safety, her experience led to immediate inspections of similar aircraft and modifications to pilot survival training. The lessons learned from her ordeal would help future pilots better prepare for similar emergencies. Master Sergeant Morrison received a commendation for his rescue dive, though he insisted that any member of his crew would have done the same thing. "That's what we train for," he said simply, "bringing people home." As Carol's strength returned over the following days, she found herself processing the psychological impact of her experience. 5 days of fighting for survival in one of Earth's most hostile environments had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had discovered reserves of determination and resourcefulness she hadn't known she possessed. But she had also confronted her own mortality in the most direct way possible. The road to full recovery would take months. Her ankle required surgery to repair ligament damage sustained during ejection and exacerbated by her wilderness trek. The frostbite damage to her fingers and toes healed completely, but for weeks she experienced painful sensitivity to cold temperatures. But Carol Brennan had survived, and her story would become legend among military aviators, a testament to the power of training, determination, and the refusal to surrender, even when facing seemingly impossible odds. 6 weeks after her rescue, Carol stood at the window of her temporary quarters at Elmendorf Air Force Base, watching F-16s take off into the Alaska sky. Each roar of jet engines sent a complex mix of emotions through her: longing, anxiety, determination, and something she couldn't quite name. Her body had healed remarkably well, but the psychological journey back to the cockpit would prove far more challenging than anyone anticipated. The Air Force Medical Board had cleared her for light duty, but full flight status remained weeks away. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the flight surgeon overseeing Carol's case, insisted on a comprehensive evaluation process that would test not just her physical capabilities, but her mental readiness to handle emergency situations. "What you experienced out there was beyond normal survival training," Dr. Martinez explained during one of their weekly sessions. "Your brain has been rewired by trauma and extreme stress. We need to understand how that might affect your decision-making under pressure before we put you back into a multi-million-dollar aircraft." The psychological evaluation process was more intense than Carol had expected. Flight psychologists subjected her to simulated emergency scenarios, monitoring her stress responses and decision-making patterns. They were particularly interested in how she would react to engine failure warnings. Would the sound of caution tones trigger flashbacks to her ejection sequence? Initial tests revealed concerning patterns. Carol's stress hormones spiked dramatically during simulated malfunctions, and her reaction times were inconsistent. More troubling, she showed signs of hypervigilance, an exhausting state of constant alertness that was common among trauma survivors, but potentially dangerous for pilots who needed to remain calm under pressure. The setback was devastating. Carol had assumed that surviving 5 days in Arctic conditions would prove her mental toughness beyond question. Instead, she found herself grounded indefinitely while psychologists worked to understand and address her trauma responses. During this period, an unexpected opportunity arose. The Air Force Survival School at Fairfield Air Force Base requested Carol's assistance in developing new Arctic survival curricula. Her real-world experience had revealed gaps in existing training that could potentially save lives in future emergencies. Working with survival instructors proved therapeutic in ways that formal counseling had not. Carol found herself reliving her ordeal, but this time in a constructive context that might help other air crews avoid her mistakes. She developed new protocols for shelter construction, fire management, and signaling procedures specifically designed for Arctic conditions. Her most significant contribution was a detailed analysis of the psychological challenges faced by isolated survivors. "The technical aspects of survival are actually the easy part," she told a class of student pilots. "The real enemy is your own mind. Panic, depression, and despair will kill you faster than cold or hunger if you let them." Carol's work at survival school led to an invitation to speak at the annual Aerospace Medical Association conference. Standing before an audience of flight surgeons, psychologists, survival experts, she shared insights that could only come from someone who had faced death and chosen to fight. "We train pilots to handle mechanical emergencies, but we don't adequately prepare them for the psychological warfare that survival situations create," she told the assembly. Your mind will try to convince you that rescue isn't coming, that you're going to die, that giving up is easier than continuing to fight. The survivors are the ones who develop strategies to win that mental battle. Her presentation was met with standing ovation, but more importantly, it marked a turning point in her own recovery. Speaking about her experience publicly helped Carol process trauma in a way that private therapy sessions had not achieved. She began to see her ordeal not as a random catastrophe, but as a source of valuable knowledge that could benefit others. 3 months after her rescue, Carol finally received medical clearance to begin flight training. But returning to the cockpit after a traumatic ejection required a carefully structured process. She started with ground-based simulators, gradually working up to actual aircraft operations. Her first flight was in a two-seat trainer with an experienced instructor pilot. As the F-16D lifted off the runway, Carol felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. This was where she belonged, three-dimensional freedom, the marriage of human skill and technological precision that defined military aviation. But the flight also revealed ongoing challenges. Every caution light, every abnormal sound triggered heightened stress responses. Her instructor noted increased tension in her voice communications and slightly delayed reactions to routine procedures. Carol was functional as a pilot, but she was not yet the confident, instinctive aviator she had been before her ejection. Recovery required patience and incremental progress. Carol flew increasingly complex training missions, slowly rebuilding the automatic responses that made expert pilots effective. She worked with sports psychologists who specialized in helping athletes overcome performance anxiety, learning visualization techniques and stress management strategies. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging training flight 6 months after her rescue. Carol was practicing low-level navigation when her instructor simulated a hydraulic failure, the same type of emergency that had preceded her ejection. Instead of the panic response that had characterized her earlier training flights, Carol found herself calmly running through emergency procedures with the methodical precision that had once defined her flying. "That's the pilot I remember," her instructor radioed as they completed the emergency checklist. "Welcome back, Brennan." But Carol's return to full operational status coincided with an unexpected career opportunity. The Pentagon had taken notice of her survival story and her contributions to training development. She received orders to Washington, D.C., where she would join a special projects office focused on improving pilot survival equipment and training. The assignment represented a significant career advancement, but it also meant leaving Alaska and the squadron where she had built her reputation. More significantly, it meant transitioning from operational flying to a desk job that would utilize her unique experience in ways that could benefit thousands of future aviators. Carol's final flight at Elmendorf was a solo mission over the same route she had flown on that February morning 8 months earlier. As she passed over the area where her F-16 had crashed, she could see the blackened scar on the mountainside. It was a sobering reminder of how close she had come to death, but also a symbol of her resilience and determination. Landing back at Elmendorf for the last time, Carol reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The woman who had ejected into the Arctic wilderness had been a competent but conventional fighter pilot. The woman who emerged from that experience had become something more, a survivor, an innovator, and ultimately a leader whose influence would extend far beyond her own cockpit. Her survival story had already been incorporated into training curricula at multiple military installations. Her insights into the psychological aspects of survival had influenced new research into stress management and resilience training. Most importantly, her experience had demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, training, determination, and the refusal to surrender could overcome seemingly impossible odds. As Carol prepared for her new assignment in Washington, she carried with her not just the memories of 5 days in the Arctic, but the knowledge that she had faced the ultimate test of human endurance and emerged stronger. Her story had become larger than her own experience. It had become a testament to the power of the human spirit to triumph over adversity.
2 years after her Arctic ordeal, Colonel Carol Brennan found herself in a situation she never could have imagined, briefing a room full of generals at the Pentagon on revolutionary changes to military survival doctrine. Her experience had evolved from personal tragedy to institutional transformation, influencing policies that would affect thousands of service members worldwide. The conference room on the fourth floor of the Pentagon buzzed with quiet intensity as Carol prepared to present findings from the most comprehensive survival research project in military history. Project Arctic Shield had consumed 18 months of her career, involving controlled experiments, advanced psychological research, and field testing that pushed the boundaries of human endurance science. "Gentlemen, what we discovered challenges fundamental assumptions about survival training," Carol began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the reality behind the statistics. "Traditional curricula focus heavily on technical skills, shelter building, fire starting, signaling, but our research reveals that psychological preparation is equally critical, and current training fails to address the mental warfare that determines who lives and who dies."
The project had grown from Carol's initial work at survival school into something far more ambitious. Working with researchers from Johns Hopkins, MIT, and the Air Force Research Laboratory, she had helped design experiments that measured stress responses, decision-making capabilities, and psychological resilience under controlled survival conditions. Test subjects, all volunteers from various military branches, were placed in simulated survival scenarios that replicated the isolation, cold, and resource scarcity that Carol had experienced. The results were startling. Even highly trained special operations personnel showed significant degradation in judgment and problem-solving abilities after just 72 hours of simulated Arctic survival conditions. "The human brain under extreme stress doesn't function the way we assume it does," Carol explained to the assembled leadership. "Sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and social isolation create a perfect storm of cognitive impairment. We're sending people into survival situations with Stone Age tools, but without Stone Age mental conditioning." Her recommendations were radical. Traditional survival training emphasized individual self-reliance, but Carol's research suggested that psychological techniques borrowed from meditation, cognitive behavioral therapy, and sports psychology could dramatically improve survival rates. She proposed mandatory mental resilience training for all aircrew, using scientifically validated techniques for managing stress and maintaining hope during extended isolation. The generals asked pointed questions about implementation costs and training time requirements. Carol had anticipated these concerns and had data to support her proposals. "The current survival course is 2 weeks long with a 15% failure rate," she noted. "Our enhanced program would be 3 weeks with preliminary results showing a 4% failure rate and significantly improved performance metrics." But Carol's work extended far beyond training programs. Her team had also developed new survival equipment based on lessons learned from real-world emergencies. The standard survival kit carried by military aviators had remained essentially unchanged for 30 years, despite advances in material science and electronics. Working with defense contractors, Carol helped design next-generation survival equipment that was lighter, more reliable, and specifically optimized for Arctic conditions. The new kit included a revolutionary shelter system that could be deployed in minutes rather than hours, advanced fire-starting technology that worked in extreme cold, and communication devices with extended battery life and better cold weather performance. The equipment innovations hadn't come easily. Carol had personally tested prototypes during brutal field exercises in Alaska, Montana, and northern Canada. Each test revealed new problems and design flaws that sent engineers back to their laboratories. The process was iterative, expensive, and sometimes dangerous, but it produced equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for future survivors. Her most controversial recommendation involved mandatory psychological screening for all aircrew. Carol's research had identified personality traits and cognitive patterns that strongly predicted survival performance. Some individuals, regardless of their technical skills or physical fitness, simply lacked the mental architecture necessary for extended survival situations.
We screen pilots for vision, reflexes, and technical aptitude. Why don't we screen for psychological resilience? A pilot who panics during a survival scenario is as dangerous as one who can't land an aircraft. The screening proposal faced significant resistance from military leadership, who worried about reducing the pool of qualified aviators. Carroll countered with data showing that the screening process could identify individuals who would benefit from additional psychological preparation, rather than simply eliminating candidates. During her Pentagon assignment, Carroll also became involved in international cooperation efforts. Her survival story had attracted attention from allied militaries, and she found herself consulting with survival experts from Canada, Norway, and other nations with extensive Arctic operations. The international collaboration revealed that the United States was actually behind some allies in survival training methodology. Norwegian Special Forces, for example, had been incorporating psychological resilience training for years, based on their extensive experience with Arctic military operations. We learned that survival isn't just an American challenge. Climate change is making extreme weather more common globally, and military operations in harsh environments are increasing. This isn't just about individual survival, it's about maintaining operational effectiveness in environments that can disable entire units. One of the most rewarding aspects of Carroll's Pentagon work was mentoring other survivors. Her office became an unofficial resource center for military personnel who had experienced their own survival ordeals. She counseled a Navy pilot who had survived 12 days in a life raft, an Army helicopter crew who had crashed in mountainous terrain, and numerous others whose stories never made headlines, but who struggled with the psychological aftermath of survival situations. These mentoring relationships taught Carroll that survival trauma was more common than military leadership recognized. Many service members suffered in silence, afraid that admitting psychological difficulties would damage their careers. Carroll worked to change this culture, advocating for better support systems and reducing the stigma associated with survival-related stress. Her advocacy efforts culminated in new policies that provided automatic psychological support for any service member involved in a survival situation lasting more than 48 hours. The policy represented a significant shift in military thinking about trauma and recovery.
As Carroll's Pentagon assignment neared its end, she faced a career decision that would define her future. She had been offered command of a fighter squadron, the traditional path for ambitious Air Force officers. Alternatively, she could continue her survival research work, possibly transitioning to a civilian role where she could influence policy across all military branches. The decision was complicated by personal factors. Carroll had married Dr. James Patterson, a military psychologist she had met during her recovery process. James supported whatever career path she chose, but their relationship had flourished partly because they shared a commitment to improving military mental health and survival capabilities. Carroll's choice would ultimately reflect how completely her Arctic experience had transformed not just her career, but her fundamental understanding of what it meant to serve. The woman who had ejected into the wilderness had been focused on personal achievement and traditional military success. The woman who emerged from that experience had discovered a calling that transcended individual ambition. Her survival story had become something larger than personal triumph. It had become a catalyst for institutional change that would protect and prepare future generations of military personnel facing their own moments of ultimate testing. 5 years after her Arctic ordeal, Brigadier General Carol Brennan stood at the edge of a familiar frozen lake in Alaska, but this time she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were 43 military personnel from 6 different countries, all participating in the first International Arctic Survival Exercise, a program that had grown directly from her research and advocacy efforts. The lake where she had once nearly died had been transformed into a state-of-the-art survival training facility. Modern heated shelters lined the shoreline, equipped with medical monitoring equipment and emergency response capabilities. But the training scenarios themselves remained as harsh and unforgiving as the conditions Carroll had faced alone in that desperate February 5 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carroll addressed the multinational group, her breath forming clouds in the -30-degree air. "What you're about to experience isn't a simulation. This environment will test every aspect of your preparation, physical, mental, and spiritual. Some of you will discover strengths you didn't know you possessed. Others will confront limitations that could save your life in a real emergency. The path that had led Carol to this moment had been anything but straight. Her Pentagon assignment had concluded with a decision that surprised many who knew her. Instead of accepting squadron command, she had chosen to establish the military's first dedicated survival research institute, based at Elmendorf Air Force Base with satellite facilities across the globe. The institute represented a revolutionary approach to survival training and research. Rather than treating survival as an afterthought to primary military training, Carol's program made psychological and physical resilience core competencies for all military personnel operating in extreme environments. The decision to return to Alaska hadn't been easy. Carol's marriage to Dr. James Patterson had evolved into a true partnership, both personal and professional. James had established his own research program studying combat stress and psychological resilience, and together they had published groundbreaking papers on trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth. Their work had attracted international attention when they demonstrated that properly structured survival training could actually reduce susceptibility to post-traumatic stress disorder. Personnel who successfully completed intensive survival programs showed improved stress management and decision-making capabilities that transferred to combat and other high-stress situations. The human mind is remarkably adaptable, James explained to a gathering of military psychologists. Controlled exposure to manageable extreme stress creates psychological inoculation. People who have successfully navigated genuine survival scenarios develop confidence and resilience that serves them throughout their careers. The concept had revolutionized military thinking about training and mental health. Instead of viewing survival training as necessary evil, something to endure and forget, military leadership began to see it as valuable preparation for the psychological demands of modern warfare. Carol's institute had become a model for other nations. The Norwegian military had partnered with her program to develop Arctic-specific protocols. Australian forces contributed expertise in desert survival that complemented her cold weather focus. Israeli special operations units shared urban survival techniques that had applications in contested environments worldwide. But the Institute's most innovative program was its civilian applications research. Carol had recognized that the psychological techniques developed for military survival had broader applications for disaster preparedness, emergency response, and even everyday stress management. Working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, her team developed training programs for first responders who might face extended deployments in disaster zones. The psychological resilience techniques that had been refined through military survival training proved remarkably effective for firefighters battling massive wildfires, search and rescue teams working earthquake zones, and medical personnel deployed to epidemic areas. The civilian crossover programs brought unexpected recognition. Carol was invited to address the World Economic Forum on climate change adaptation, speaking to business leaders and government officials about the psychological challenges of environmental disasters. Climate change isn't just about rising temperatures and sea levels, she told the assembled delegates. It's about human beings facing unprecedented survival challenges. The techniques we've developed for military personnel can help civilian populations build resilience for an uncertain future. Her presentation led to consulting contracts with major corporations whose operations exposed employees to extreme environments. Oil companies operating in Arctic regions, mining operations in remote locations, and research organizations working in Antarctica all sought her expertise in developing psychological preparation programs. But Carol's most personal project remained the memorial she had established at the site of her original survival ordeal. The Carol Brennan Survival Education Center occupied a modest building overlooking the lake where she had nearly died. The center offered courses for civilian adventurers, corporate groups, and anyone interested in understanding their own psychological limits and capabilities. The memorial aspect honored not just her own experience, but the hundreds of military personnel who had died in survival situations that might have been preventable with better training and equipment. A wall inside the center listed names and stories of aircrew who hadn't been as fortunate as Carol, serving as a sobering reminder of why the work mattered. Visitors to the center often asked Carol about the psychological impact of her survival experience. Her answer had evolved over the years as she gained perspective on how the ordeal had changed her. "For a long time, I focused on the 5 days I spent fighting to stay alive," she would tell them. But the real transformation happened over the 5 years that followed. Survival isn't just about not dying, it's about what you do with the life you've preserved. Carol's research had identified what psychologists termed post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where individuals emerge from traumatic experiences stronger and more capable than before. Her own life exemplified this concept, but she had also documented it in hundreds of other survival cases. The data showed that people who received proper psychological support after survival ordeals often developed enhanced leadership capabilities, improved stress tolerance, and a clearer sense of purpose. These individuals frequently became high performers in their chosen fields, driven by a profound understanding of their own resilience. This research had influenced military personnel policies in ways that extended far beyond survival training. The armed forces began viewing challenging experiences not as obstacles to overcome, but as opportunities for development when properly supported and integrated. Carol's work with veteran populations had been particularly rewarding. Many former military personnel struggled with the transition to civilian life, feeling that their combat experiences had no relevance in peaceful environments. Carol's programs helped veterans recognize that their stress tolerance, decision-making abilities, and leadership skills represented valuable assets in civilian careers. She had established mentoring programs that paired veterans with successful business leaders, many of whom had never served in the military, but recognized the value of the psychological strengths that military service could develop. The programs had impressive success rates, with participating veterans showing higher rates of educational achievement, career advancement, and life satisfaction. As Carol watched the international training exercise participants begin their survival scenarios, she reflected on how far the field had progressed. The scared pilot who had ejected into the Arctic 5 years earlier could never have imagined that her ordeal would lead to institutional changes affecting militaries worldwide. The participants in today's exercise carried equipment that had been designed based on her survival experience. They had received psychological preparation that incorporated techniques she had helped develop. Most importantly, they understood that survival wasn't just about technical skills, it was about maintaining hope, making rational decisions under stress, and refusing to surrender even when circumstances seemed hopeless. But perhaps Carol's most significant contribution was changing how society viewed survival itself. Instead of seeing survival situations as random catastrophes to be endured, her work had reframed them as opportunities for human beings to discover their own extraordinary capabilities. "Everyone has survival potential," became her signature message. The difference between those who survive and those who don't usually isn't physical strength or technical knowledge. It's the ability to maintain psychological control when everything seems to be falling apart. As the sun set over the Alaska wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and purple, Carol felt a deep sense of completion. The woman who had once fought alone against impossible odds had become someone who ensured that others would never have to face such challenges unprepared. Her survival story had evolved from personal triumph to institutional transformation to global influence. But at its core, it remained what it had always been, a testament to the power of the human spirit to not just endure, but to grow stronger through adversity. The Arctic wilderness that had once threatened to claim her life had become the foundation for a legacy that would protect and inspire countless others. In saving herself, Carol Brennan had ultimately saved many more, a ripple effect of resilience that would continue long after her own story had ended. Standing at the edge of the lake where her transformation had begun, Carol smiled as she watched the newest generation of survival trainees begin their own journeys of discovery. Each of them carried within themselves the same potential for extraordinary courage and resilience that had brought her through those 5 desperate days in the frozen wilderness. The evening brought unexpected visitors to the training facility. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison, now retired, had driven up from Anchorage with his family to observe the exercise.
The man who had saved Carol's life in the frigid water had become something of a legend himself, though he remained characteristically modest about his heroic actions. "General, you've built something incredible here," Morrison said, as they watched participants construct emergency shelters in the gathering darkness. "When I pulled you out of that water, I never imagined it would lead to all this."
Morrison's presence reminded Carol of a crucial aspect of survival that her research had increasingly emphasized: the importance of human connection and mutual aid. Her initial survival experience had been solitary, but subsequent research had shown that group survival scenarios often produced better outcomes when participants were trained to work collaboratively rather than focusing solely on individual self-preservation. This insight had led to the development of team-based survival protocols that were now standard across multiple military branches. Units deployed to extreme environments received training not just in individual survival skills, but in group psychology, leadership under stress, and decision-making processes that maintained unit cohesion during crisis situations. The collaborative approach had proven particularly valuable in modern military operations, where personnel often operated in small teams in austere environments. Carroll's Institute had documented numerous cases where proper team survival training had prevented mission failures and saved lives in combat zones. One such case involved a special operations team that had been isolated for 3 weeks in mountainous terrain after their extraction helicopter was shot down. Using techniques developed at Carroll's Institute, the team maintained discipline and morale while evading enemy forces and surviving on minimal resources until rescue arrived. The team leader later credited their survival training with keeping the unit together and functional throughout the ordeal. Carroll's work had also attracted attention from space agencies planning long-duration missions. NASA and the European Space Agency had consulted with her on psychological preparation for Mars missions, recognizing that astronauts would face isolation and resource constraints similar to those encountered in terrestrial survival situations. The space agency consultations had led to some of Carroll's most fascinating research. Working with astronaut psychologists, she had developed protocols for maintaining mental health during extended isolation that had applications far beyond space exploration. The techniques were being tested in submarine operations and Arctic research stations and other environments where small groups of people live in confined spaces for extended periods. But perhaps the most unexpected application of Carroll's survival psychology research came from the technology sector. Major tech companies had begun incorporating her stress management and decision-making techniques into leadership development programs, recognizing that business leaders often face high-stress situations that required the same psychological tools that helped people survive physical emergencies. Silicon Valley executives attended modified versions of Carroll's survival courses, learning to maintain clear thinking under pressure, make critical decisions with limited information, and lead teams through crisis situations. The programs had become so popular that Carroll had established a separate civilian division of her institute dedicated to corporate training. The corporate programs generated revenue that helped fund her military research and veteran support programs. Carroll had insisted that her institute maintain its core mission of supporting military personnel, even as civilian applications expanded. The financial success of corporate training allowed her to offer free programs for veterans and active duty personnel who might not otherwise have access to advanced survival training. One of Carroll's most ambitious recent projects involved developing survival psychology applications for disaster-prone regions worldwide. Working with international development organizations, she had created culturally adapted survival training programs for communities facing recurring natural disasters. In Bangladesh, her team worked with local leaders to develop flood survival protocols that incorporated both modern psychological techniques and traditional community resilience practices. The program had been tested during the 2023 monsoon season when several communities using Carroll's techniques showed significantly better outcomes in terms of both physical survival and post-disaster mental health. Similar programs were being developed for earthquake-prone regions in Central America, drought-affected areas in sub-Saharan Africa, and wildfire-threatened communities in Australia.
Each program required careful adaptation to local cultures, resources, and specific environmental challenges. The international development work had brought Carol full circle in some ways. Her own survival story had begun with a technological failure, a sophisticated military aircraft brought down by a mechanical defect. But her response to that failure was fundamentally human: determination, resourcefulness, and the refusal to surrender hope. Now she was helping communities around the world develop those same fundamentally human qualities, often in places where high technology was unavailable or unreliable. The psychological tools that had kept her alive in the Arctic proved remarkably transferable to very different survival challenges. Carol's academic credentials had grown along with her practical experience. She had completed a doctorate in psychology through a joint program with the University of Alaska, writing her dissertation on neurological changes in extreme stress survival situations. Her research used brain imaging technology to document how survival experiences literally rewired neural pathways, often in ways that enhanced cognitive performance under stress. The neurological research had implications that extended far beyond survival training. Carol's work was contributing to broader understanding of human adaptability and resilience, with potential applications to treating post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety disorders. Medical schools had begun incorporating her research into curricula for emergency medicine residents and trauma surgeons. The psychological techniques that helped survival instructors remain calm and focused during training emergencies proved equally valuable for medical personnel dealing with mass casualty events or other high-stress medical situations.
As the evening progressed, Carol walked among the survival exercise participants, observing their progress and offering quiet guidance when needed. Her presence had a calming effect that trainees often mentioned in after-action reports. Knowing that their instructor had faced genuine life-or-death situations and survived gave students confidence in the training process. But Carol's interactions with students also continued to teach her new things about human psychology and resilience. Each group of trainees brought different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives that enriched her understanding of how people responded to extreme stress. She had learned that cultural background significantly influenced survival psychology. Military personnel from different countries approached survival challenges with distinct mindsets shaped by their national cultures and military traditions. Understanding these differences had become crucial for designing effective international training programs. Age and experience also created interesting variations in survival psychology. Younger personnel often had physical advantages, but sometimes lacked the emotional regulation skills that came with maturity. Older trainees might be less physically capable, but often demonstrated superior judgment and stress management abilities. Gender differences in survival psychology had become another area of significant research. Carol's own experience as a female survivor had provided unique insights, and her institute had documented important variations in how men and women approached survival challenges. These findings had influenced training methodologies and equipment design. The research had shown that mixed-gender survival teams often performed better than single-gender groups, with different psychological approaches complementing each other effectively. This finding had influenced military policy regarding team composition for operations in extreme environments. As midnight approached and the exercise participants settled into their shelters for the night, Carol returned to her quarters at the training facility. Her living space was modest but comfortable, decorated with photographs and mementos from her years of research and training development. One photograph showed her standing with a group of survivors from various military branches, pilots, sailors, soldiers, and Marines who had all faced their own survival ordeals and found their way to her programs. Their stories had become part of the larger narrative of human resilience that Carol's work documented and celebrated. Another photograph captured her receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of her contributions to military preparation and survival training. The ceremony had been emotional for Carol, representing not just personal recognition but acknowledgement of the broader importance of survival psychology research. But perhaps her most treasured photograph showed her with James and their two young children at the lake where her survival journey had begun.
The image captured a moment of perfect peace and happiness, made more meaningful by its contrast with the desperate circumstances she had once faced in the same location. The children had grown up hearing simplified versions of their mother's story, understanding it as a tale of courage and determination rather than trauma and near death. Carol was careful to emphasize the positive lessons of her experience while being age-appropriately honest about the dangers she had faced. Her children's presence had added new dimensions to her understanding of survival psychology. Becoming a mother had heightened her awareness of the protective instincts that often motivated survival behavior. Many of the survivors she worked with cited thoughts of family and loved ones as crucial factors in their determination to live. This insight had led to the development of family-focused survival training programs that prepared not just military personnel, but their spouses and children for the psychological challenges of deployment and potential emergency situations. The programs had shown significant benefits for military family resilience and readiness. As Carol prepared for sleep, she reflected on the continuing evolution of her work and its impact. The 5 days she had spent fighting for survival in the Arctic had become the foundation for a lifetime of service that touched thousands of lives worldwide. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities. A delegation from the United Nations was scheduled to visit the facility, interested in developing global standards for disaster preparedness training. Several major universities had proposed research collaborations that could advance understanding of human resilience. A documentary film crew was planning to chronicle her institute's work for international distribution. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of wind across the frozen lake and the quiet activity of survival trainees learning to overcome their own limitations, Carol felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived with purpose. Her survival story had become something far greater than personal triumph. It had become a force for positive change that would continue long after her own career had ended. The Arctic wilderness that had once threatened to claim her life had become her greatest teacher and closest collaborator. In learning to survive its challenges, she had discovered not just her own resilience, but the extraordinary potential that exists within every human being to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her story was complete, but their stories were just beginning, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful legacy of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.